Hi everyone. Today I just wanted to take a little time to do a bit of an introductory lecture to the Marrow of Tradition, which according to our syllabus, which I have right here, you began reading last Wednesday, 9/16. By today, of course today is the 22nd of September, but by yesterday, 9/21, you were meant to have at least begun reading around chapters 11 to 15. That was Monday's homework. So for today's, kind of brief recorded lecture, my first attempt at a recorded lecture as well, so bear with me. I just wanted to take a little time basically to introduce Chesnutt's novel to you, where the title comes from, a little bit about the historical context in which the novel is set, and then also a little bit of a talk about some major themes in the novel, just a few. I didn't want to overwhelm. And also, full disclosure, if you've worked with me in class before live, you know I have a tendency to ramble, go off on tangents. So I am using notes today for this talk, just so you know. I'll be reading from some papers, mostly just to keep myself on task and make sure that I get through this talk for you guys efficiently, so that you're not here looking at my talking head for too long. Okay, so just to jump right in then. The Marrow of Tradition, Charles Chesnutt's novel, came out around 1901. It's a novel that deals with the complex issues of racial tensions between white and Black Americans in the late 19th century United States South. The tensions of the novel are not just between races, however, it's important to keep in mind, but there are also tensions the novel tracks within African American communities as well. It's a novel filled with characters of complex identity, so race is an internal matter to these characters, internal, as much as it is an external political or social matter, which it is also in the novel. So the book's title, The Marrow of Tradition, show and tell, comes from a line in a poem by Charles Lamb, who was a 19th century English writer. You might have worked with him in other classes before. So the novel's epigraph contains a few lines from that poem by Lamb, and it goes like this, quote, "I like you and your book, ingenious hone, in whose capacious all-embracing leaves the very marrow of traditions shown," end quote. So this poem actually makes a reference as well. So you have Chesnutt's book title making a reference to a poem by Charles Lamb, and then Charles Lamb's poem makes a reference, with that line I read you, believe it or not, to an 1824 book written by a British bookseller by the title of The Everyday Book. This book was something like a predecessor to the Almanac. Basically, this volume was a chronicle of everyday British life with commentary on both important days and events like All Saints' Day, important religious happenings of the year, but as well as banal everyday street life news from London as well. So Lamb praises the book in his poem because, as he says, it embraces all of life and an essence of an antiquarian tradition. And that's fine. However, for Chesnutt's purposes, it's important for us to keep in mind, or to know, really, that Chesnutt uses this quote, "the marrow of tradition," ironically, as he adopts it for his title. And that is because the marrow of tradition, as it's referenced by Lamb in his referring to the book, the Everyday Book, the 1824 text, this is a white tradition. In it, there is no African-American perspective at all, no point of view. So this quote illustrates Chesnutt's overarching theme in the Marrow of Tradition, which is the tyranny of the white ruling class, particularly in the late 19th century, in their efforts to recover a slaveholding tradition, and the struggles, of course, of the African-American communities to overcome this tyranny. So that's the overarching, primary driving theme of Charles Chesnutt's The Marrow of Tradition. And as I'll discuss in a couple minutes, there are several other major themes that kind of come under that big umbrella that help to add detail to it, show different ways that that major theme or primary theme can be explored, and so on. But I'll get into that in a few moments. Just a little bit more about this context. As I mentioned, the late 19th century, this kind of tension between tyranny of certain classes of white Southerners who want to, quote unquote, recover a slaveholding tradition, and between a tension between them and then, of course, African Americans and African American communities that are trying to overcome this tyranny. The setting of the book is very important as well, with respect to playing off of that primary theme. The Marrow of Tradition is set in Wilmington, North Carolina, and its events, the events of the novel, are based upon real life events. There was a massacre, a race riot of sorts, in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. It's referred to as the Wilmington Massacre. The book falls into, therefore the Marrow of Tradition, it's important for us to know, falls into the genre of historical fiction. And that's because, well, just to describe what a work of historical fiction essentially is, it's a work in which settings, events, and characters are generally drawn from real life and real life events in history. However, there are also, particularly characters, are also fictionalized in order to create a coherent and gripping narrative. So the author's intention in doing this is to capture essentially the spirit, the meaning, and the conditions of a particular time in history, a particular set of events perhaps, but not necessarily to capture actual historical details. So the book, The Marrow of Tradition, is thus a novel. It's fiction instead of a work of nonfiction. That's an important distinction to keep in mind. This novel is also a didactic work. In other words, it's an argument against racial prejudice and the violent act of lynching in particular. So a little bit more about the Marrow of Tradition. I don't want to get into any spoilers, so I want to make sure I stop myself in my notes at the right time. So the Marrow of Tradition focuses on families and relationships more than events. So even though there is an important, although trigger warning, violent and problematic racially motivated event towards the end of the novel that is based on the Wilmington massacres, that event, horrible and shocking though it is not the focus of the entire novel, The Marrow of Tradition. And as a matter of fact, if you've actually had a chance to begin reading in the novel, I'm sure that's become immediately clear to you. If you did read a little background on the novel and learned about how it's related to or based on these massacres and riots in the late 19th century, it might surprise you because the novel actually focuses a lot more on human relationships and families. And by doing this, Chesnutt's allowed to explore the complex set of emotions that fostered the violence of the massacre. So basically, by getting into the details of human relationships, how families function or dysfunction in the novel, Chesnutt's able to kind of begin to track the emotions, the sensations, the attitudes that gear the community in a particular set of directions. So since the novel was written in 1901, the novel's setting exudes a mood of an antebellum South. There's an anxiety felt by all the characters, black and white, for a time that is passing and a future that is uncertain. So I don't want to give too much away there. So the novel shifts narrative point of view, between many characters. So keep that in mind as you're reading. From one chapter to the next, you might not have the same storyteller. The story of the novel might come to us through different eyes from one section or one chapter to the next. So pay attention to that. The point of view, though, the narrative point of view, important to know, will always come to us from a character that comes from one of three major families in the novel. So the novel, in other words, has many narrators, not worth naming here, in fact, but all of them come from the novel's primary three starring families. And those are the Carteret family, the Millers, and the Delameres. So those are the three kind of starring families in the novel. And without getting into any spoilers about the chapters or specific events, although I do welcome more discussion of that if you want to email me with any questions or just to talk about the novel, schedule a Zoom meeting with me, please feel free. I welcome stuff like that. But also, too, I will be preparing more materials for you to complete in the form of activities and so on Blackboard. That'll help you kind of track your progress through the novel and check in with, what's going on in the novel, your understanding of events, kind of write and think about it a little bit, too. That's just as a heads up, of course. We're still in the middle of the thing here, not even at chapter 15 in our own reading, according to the syllabus yet. So it's still early days. But right now, I do want to switch gears, keeping all that in mind. I want to switch gears just to talk about a small handful of some major themes in the novel. Really some major driving forces of events and character relationships and things that I think are worth kind of drawing out, getting into your notes for consideration, just so you can track the progress of these ideas, perhaps, as the novel goes on. And also provide you with a lot to talk about, maybe, when we get together on October 5th. So, the first of these 4 major themes I want to talk about is mixed race is the first one. Mixed race characters in particular and the role they play in the Marrow of Tradition, the novel. Excuse me, burping at you. So Chesnutt uses mixed race characters, in other words, those who have both Black and white ancestry, as physical representations of the conflict between Black and white society in the world he depicts in the novel. In his own life, actually, Chesnutt characterized this as his descent from a quote-unquote ragged tree. And I don't want to give too much away in terms of how Chesnutt's own life links up with the novel or any spoilers. There is one character in the novel, Janet Miller. She's probably the best example of a mixed race character and how they're deployed very intentionally by Chesnutt in the narrative. So the mixed race individual, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, so I'm skipping a little down in my notes. The mixed race individual symbolizes the inevitable union of the races. The individual in their personhood becomes a site of tension as they attempt to live in 2 worlds, and neither of which fully recognizes them as their own. So they're also somewhat, I don't want to go so far as to say tragic figures, because I don't think Chesnutt goes that far, but they're a bit maudlin. But that's just my opinion. Do with that what you will. Keep an eye on Janet Miller, for instance, and form your own opinion of her. I'm really interested. I'd be really interested to talk about that, actually, and probably will with you guys on October 5th. So just as to go on with that example, the Millers, Janet Miller. The Millers, for instance, they're a well-educated family, well-to-do, and they have been educated and brought up in the arguably upper-class white world. And they find that, however, they live an arguably separate existence from their poor, uneducated, comparatively, and mostly Black neighbors. So the white world, however, does not welcome the Millers entirely either, because they lack what certain characters in this white world of the novel refer to as purity. An interesting and problematic idea that you'll see, for instance, the Carterets, the patriarch of the family, perhaps, bring up conversationally. So mixed race characters are very symbolically important and interesting to track in the novel. And again, as I said, I recommend keeping your eye on Janet. But again, email me with any questions or discussion you might want to have. The next, just to move on, keeping with the time here. So the next major theme in the novel worth keeping your eye on and trying to track the progress of as you move through the text is the relationship between race and domestic life in the novel. Chesnutt's novel is really unique for the time in which it was written in particular, because it's one of the first realist texts to depict race in terms of both Black and white domestic life. For modern readers like us, some of these depictions often seem kind of contradictory. So for instance, white families in the novel take in Black servants, hire them because it's post-slavery, so they hire them, take them into their home. Though many of these servants live in these huge houses with these white wealthy families, and domestic ties begin to form, often becoming strong and familial. Just as an example, the Carteret family's relationship with Mammy Jane, who we meet really early on in the novel. That's probably one of the best examples in the whole text of that kind of a familial bond forming out of service or out of employment. Mammy Jane, having nursed both Olivia Carteret, her mother, and now Olivia's child, feels a loyalty to the family that goes far beyond a servant-employer relationship. The Carteret family returns that same familial bond, though you'll notice in the novel it has limitations. And that's the point of contradiction to many modernist readers that kind of, or modern readers, sorry, like us, that kind of stands out. You know, why is the familial bond not 100% on the Carteret's side of the equation? Well, interestingly, it is contradictory. And Chesnutt, interestingly too, isn't, and this is one of the many ways really that this novel is quite ahead of its time as a piece that just came out of the very turn of the 20th century. he's not afraid to paint that contradiction as clear as it is. The fact that the familial bond isn't equal. And he actually, he allows that contradiction through these characters' interactions and the ways they behave and speak, perhaps outside of one another's company, like when Mammy Jane isn't present, for instance. He lets that contradictory set of values play out even further, almost as though he's trying to force the reader to ask questions about these kinds of values and why, what they're good for anyway, if they're so contradictory. So this also seems contradictory as an example. However, to the public opinions of segregation and white supremacy stated by the same families that take these servants into their homes. So what I mean by this is, yes, there's a contradiction of the unequal relationship. You can see that pretty clearly, even if you're just reading in the first few chapters, particularly in the example of Mammy Jane. When these white families are outside the company of their servants, essentially, their public opinions of segregation and ideas that they seem to clearly hold, particularly with regards to white supremacy, come to the fore. And one might even wonder, as you're reading this, pay attention to certain dinner scenes, for instance, at the Carteret household, and how people speak about race when servants are not in the room. One might wonder, why would these families even want to have servants of color if they feel so strongly against these folks? Well, the Black servants are welcome. Chesnutt paints this picture intentionally, again, to teach the reader. These Black servants are welcome only as long as they follow the strict rules of segregation and inequality that are stipulated by the white ruling class, or the employing class, to be fair. Domestic life, therefore, is contingent on political life in regards to race. So that relationship between race and domestic life, it goes far beyond that too, far beyond dinner conversations and things said in public or private that you or I in the 21st century might consider a faux pas. There's so much more to it than that. For instance, there's a younger maid who's hired into the same household as Mammy Jane, and she's also a woman of color, but she and Mammy Jane have some tensions. There's some questions inside of this theme of race and domestic life. There's some additional questions added onto that about generations and generational gaps and things like that. So Chesnutt does a lot of work with this theme, the relationship between race and domestic life in the novel. So it could be, if that's particularly something that's interesting to you as you're reading or thinking about culture and society, that's something worth tracking in the novel, because there's a lot of work done with it. Just pay attention to families in particular in the text. So I'm starting to ramble, so I'm going to move on. The next major theme I wanted to get across to you guys was the morality depicted of the African-American community in Charles Chesnutt's novel. Chesnutt wrote the Marrow of tradition and infused its African-American communities with the morality that he does intentionally. So as, in other words, so as to work as a foil against the stereotypes, specifically racial stereotypes, of the violent, sexualized, ignorant Black man and the corrupt, immoral Black female that were predominant at the turn of the 20th century, late 19th century. So throughout his novel, Chesnutt alludes to actual news stories carried in the nation's most reputable newspapers. Of course, there is a newspaper office specifically in the world of the Marrow tradition that takes a very central role, so note that. And of course, that setting, the news office in the novel, is a convenient place where Chesnutt is able to kind of allude through narrative to actual news stories carried in some of the most reputable newspapers in the United States about African-American men and women being charged for heinous crimes which were likely exaggerated, if not completely false. Chesnutt even infuses his narrative in the Marrow tradition with his own example of a situation like this playing out. I don't want to give anything away. I really want you to dig into starting to read the novel on your own. But pay attention, look out for the character Sandy. He is a character who, he's not a perfect guy, but he's a good person, but for all intents and purposes, he gets himself entangled into a set of circumstances largely beyond his own control or doing, that do not make him look that way at all. He's set up. And in a way, Chesnutt's trying to show through other things in the text play out we can talk about on October 5th. I'll probably give you a little writing assignment on this as well in the interim. But the way the situation plays out is largely to shield and protect, as Sandy's reputation is being dragged through the mud and he's being convicted, etc., or being threatened with conviction. This is all really subtext to protect another man who belongs to a very wealthy family and who may not be Black, and so on. I don't want to give too much away, but again, very interesting. The problem of morality and the stereotyping, the common stereotyping at the time of the novel was published, the time the novel takes place, the setting, was so common that Chesnutt wants to put that in there for readers to see. But then he also creates, internal to the novel, African-American communities that purposefully kind of contrast with that stereotype or sets of stereotypes, to show a greater complexity and humanness to African-American people living in the South, living in places like Wilmington, North Carolina, and so on. Let me see, I'm rambling again. So these stereotypes, Chesnutt's novel suggests, even influence policy toward African-Americans in northern states that had been sympathetic to the plights of Southern Black communities. And there's some evidence to support that. So in order to recast the Black community, or Black Southern communities, to be fair, in more positive, more complex human lights, Chesnutt created African-American characters for his novel who were politically involved, who believe in progressivism, for instance. They believe in family values, middle-class capitalist values, as well as, to be fair, the work of democracy to create a great and unified nation. So this community and its expressed values contrasts, therefore, with the blind hatred of white supremacist groups who, not only in the historical context that Chesnutt works to recreate, but also inside the actual novel itself, there are white supremacist groups who perpetrate violence for no reason other than to reinforce their own positions of power. And so he tries to contrast against that with the way African-American communities, families, individuals are depicted in his novel, at the very least. And then finally, the fourth major theme I wanted to discuss with you guys today. I need some water. Please excuse me. I need to do that in class, in real life too. So the fourth and final major theme is the complexity of money, class, and race. And Chesnutt does a lot with this in the novel throughout. It's a really major theme in that it operates so subtly, and the entanglements and braiding together of issues related to money, class, and race are so predominating across the novel. It can almost be redundant to begin to speak to, but I have a little bit of notes here for you anyway, a little bit of examples and stuff for you to maybe get in your notes and work to track this theme of complexity, the complexity of money, class, and race in the novel. So Chesnutt realistically portrays, arguably, the complexities caused by issues of money, class, and race, particularly when they collide, as they do in the post-Reconstruction South that he depicts. So Chesnutt creates a post-Reconstruction world in which the norms of class have been, the norms of class in, the pre-Civil War South, of course, have been completely overturned. Okay, so for instance, let me begin to explain what I mean by this. So the Carteret family, they're one of the three major families I mentioned earlier on in this talk. The Carterets represent the old Southern Guard. So what do I mean by that? Essentially, they're a wealthy white family that owns a lot of land and has a lot of money. Essentially, they used to own slaves, significant numbers. So they're the former ruling class, or really the Carterets represent the former ruling class of the South. And they're not friendly toward African-American people, the Carteret family. I already kind of started to teaser trailer that a few moments ago, but there you have it. So their hatred toward African-Americans in the novel, you might begin to get the sense as you read, is actually the result of feelings of displacement that the Carterets have toward this up-and-coming Black middle and upper class. that you see in the novel. Pay attention to the Millers, for instance. A former slave driver, another example of someone who in many ways embodies this complexity, but also specifically the complexity of how money, class, and race entwined can work. There's a character you'll come across in the novel called McBain. He's a white man, and well, he's not the most pleasant character, but he is friendly with the Carterets. But you might quickly catch on to the fact that he doesn't belong to the same social echelon as the Carterets. Let me just get into my notes. McBain further magnifies this sense of displacement in his own way, and not because he belongs to any kind of Southern old guard. McBain actually comes from a poor Southern white family. So he was a former slave driver, as a matter of fact, this character McBain, during the time of slavery, during the Civil War. So a former slave driver, McBain was not considered respectable until he made money after the war. And even then, you find in the novel, his money can't buy him into Wellington society. Chesnutt's novel seeks to describe how the forces of democratic rule and capitalism upended Southern society after the Civil War. So try as he might, even though he has money and the trappings of the appearance of respectability now, post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction, the character McBain, you'll find, still isn't quite considered as respectable as the Carterets, and he also doesn't perhaps hold as high a position in society as certain other families or members of certain families of color in that same town. And that's more of that feeling of being displaced that comes from the complexity and the braiding together of money, class, and race that the novel constantly puts on show for us. So Chesnutt's novel seeks to describe how the forces of democratic rule and capitalism upended Southern society after the Civil War. And he emphasizes that economic anxiety was not just merely a race problem or a problem based on, for example, freeing and now paying former slaves for their labor, but it was instead, Chesnutt would maintain, the problem essentially of a changing economic world, a world in which free labor was no longer permissible. And that, while that sounds all well and good, the novel plays out many of the tensions and issues and problems that can result from that, especially such a swift change, particularly to the economics of a society. But for today, that's about all I have for you right now, just to introduce the novel, like I said. And good luck in your progressing through it. Keep up with the text as best you can. I recommend, although not exclusively, but I recommend supplementing any actual reading in the text or in an ebook text that you have if you have to commute to work or if you're an essential worker. For folks in situations like that, you find yourself doing a lot of chores around the house, perhaps. For folks in situations like those, I recommend audiobooks to help keep you kind of up to speed with the reading assignments. But please do not work exclusively from audiobooks. That will not be sufficient. Whether we're talking about the novel, referencing it in a discussion that we have together, or writing about it for your first formal essay assignment, which was posted to Blackboard last week. So keep an eye on that as well. But that's enough for me for now. If you have any questions, issues, anything like that, problems, something you're worried about, please shoot me an email. Don't hesitate. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much for listening to me for all this time, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Bye for now, guys.